Jim Miller versus Roosevelt Roberts takes place this weekend on the main card of UFC Fight Night 173 Vegas 3, Blaydes versus Volkov, and I can't wait for this matchup. You've got Roosevelt Roberts on one side. This is the typical story in MMA that some fighters get to at one point in their career. Roosevelt Roberts, the young up-and-comer, 26 years of age, coming off the Contender Series, been on a good run in the UFC. Of course, lost to Vince Pichel. It was his first loss of his professional career. I'm sure we can't blame him. He was only 24 at the time. Relatively new to MMA. He jumped straight in the deep end. He hasn't really fought a plethora of guys, but he's won every single one of them, so of course he's going to get fast-tracked to the UFC. Came up against Vince Pichel, who's a tricky veteran with great grappling. Vince Pichel kind of had a little bit of a way with him, but since then, Roosevelt Roberts completely adjusted his game, showed that he can deal with similar grappling in Alexander Yakovlev, who's a veteran that tried to implement grappling on Roosevelt Roberts. Not the same level of grappling as Vince Pichel, of course, but still, it was good to see a guy use the same style that just beat Roosevelt Roberts on Roosevelt Roberts to show that Roosevelt has somewhat worked on his takedown defense. Then he bounces back in a major way against Brock Weaver. Sensational performance. I mean, there was never really a problem with Roosevelt Roberts' takedown defense. Vince Pichel is just a very underrated fighter in the lightweight division because he's not active. Vince Pichel is a savage, been around forever, was on the same season of The Ultimate Fighter as Ally Quinter all the way back in the day, and is a great fighter, a veteran, showed Roosevelt Roberts a few things. I think Roosevelt Roberts has learned his lesson. Usually after the first loss of someone's career, if they're going on a 2-fight win streak, they're pretty switched on and they seem to have adjusted. But again, Brock Weaver is not the biggest win. I will go into that, but still an amazing win. Then you've got Jim Miller on the other side of things, the veteran of the UFC. This fight has taken place at catchweight, which I feel actually gives Jim Miller a little bit of an advantage as the older man who's obviously going to struggle with the weight cut a little bit more if they are similar sized, which they are somewhat. Roosevelt Roberts, the taller guy with the reach advantage, which we'll get into in a second. But they're not huge lightweights. They're not small lightweights. They're somewhere in between. So for the older guy not to have to cut as much weight, I think that's actually going to benefit Jim Miller somewhat. But still, I just saw in his last fight, and Jim Miller's had this career of ups and downs. We know who he loses to. We know who he kind of beats. He's in the very middle ground of the lightweight division. He loses to names like Charles Oliveira, Dan Hooker, Francisco Trinaldo. Still a decent fighter, tricky fighter that can pose some problems to some people. Loses to Anthony Pettis, Dustin Poirier, Michael Chiesa, Beneil Dariush, Donald Cerrone. He's had an up and down career where he's lost to some of these really good names. But then you look at some of the names like Scott Holtzman that's been added to his career recently. And I like Scott Holtzman, don't get me wrong, and I consider him a good fighter. But still, it was a sign that maybe you can't beat the guys you're supposed to beat anymore, in my opinion. And when we see that up and down in someone's career where they can beat all of the guys underneath them but just can't quite crack the top 5, and then one of these somewhat average guys in Scott Holtzman is managing to break through. I mean, Scott Holtzman lost a fight to Nick Lentz by unanimous decision at lightweight not too long ago as well. I mean, he kind of just got out-grappled by Nick Lentz and still managed to put a whooping on Jim Miller, I'll be honest. He doesn't even have some of the best wins in the UFC. Lost to Josh Emmett as well, lost to Drew Dober, so we kind of know where his level is. Scott Holtzman is somewhere below the talent pool of the rankings, and even he was able to get a jump on Jim Miller. That tells me that maybe things are beginning to change for the 36-year-old Jim Miller. And at these lighter weight classes, listen, you can be 40 at heavyweight, and I don't really give a shit. You're 36 at lightweight. You can maybe be Woodley age at welterweight, but not anymore because we're seeing Woodley start to fade as well. It seems to be one of those ages, especially in the lightweight division. Unless you're Tony Ferguson, you need your speed. You need your reaction time. Those are the attributes that you need to have as a lightweight in a lower weight class. And when they start to go, and I kind of saw that against Scott Holtzman, I mean, it could be the case that Jim Miller was injured, but I didn't hear anything from that, and he took a lot of damage in that Scott Holtzman fight. I just think that Roosevelt Roberts is going to get a jump on him. I really do. Roosevelt Roberts is improving dramatically between every single fight that he's had. He had a little bit of a lackluster performance against Alexander Yakovlev, but he's a veteran and he got the job done. He looked very technical in the fight. He looked like he improved on his striking dramatically. Then he comes into the Brock Weaver fight and I know Brock Weaver is not the best opponent in the world, but still he's 15-4. I know there's some split decisions on his career, but 15-4 is a good fighter, and he made Brock Weaver look like a bum. Like, he just completely schooled Brock Weaver, was talking to him the entire time, actually is sitting down on his punches now, which I think is going to lead to a lot more finishes in Roosevelt Roberts' career. He's sitting down on his punches, he's starting to trust his combinations, and he lit Brock Weaver up, and then just immediately showed a massive difference in the ground game. If Brock Weaver was taking on Jim Miller, I would also pick Jim Miller. Don't get me wrong, but Roosevelt Roberts, the taller guy with the reach advantage. I like a taller guy with a reach advantage. I feel like it gives them if you're a taller guy with a reach disadvantage, I pay no attention to the height almost whatsoever, especially when you're a guy who's pretty boxing orientated. If you're a taller guy with a lot of kicks, I could see that maybe a reach disadvantage wouldn't affect you as much, and your leg length may get you by. But with Roosevelt Roberts, he's a taller guy with crisp boxing. He's improving every time. Jim Miller's coming off a lot of damage. Roosevelt Roberts has just been in a full camp under these conditions. He's fought under these conditions as well. Jim Miller has not, even though he's a veteran, he still has not fought under these conditions. And Roosevelt Roberts might have the most experience in this style of fight because he's been on the Contender Series and he's fought under these conditions, and now he's about to do it again. I like his odds. I really do. Roosevelt Roberts is going to get the job done. I don't think he's going to finish Jim Miller. I'm not sleeping on Jim Miller that much. I know he's a savage. He can still put the lights out. He can still crank on a submission and get you out of there in the first round. I'm not going to disregard him in that way to say that Roberts finishes him. I just feel as though Roberts is going to edge out every round by just being the more hungry fighter at the end of those rounds, looking for the takedown, wanting to win more, putting more behind his punches, having more volume and using more output. I think he's going to score way more on judges' scorecards, get the win over Jim Miller. And I like Roosevelt Roberts, man. I'm a big fan. Bout money on his chest speaks volumes to me, and he's handling his UFC career as well. Listen, all of the situation about fighter pay right now, people could learn a thing or two about Roosevelt Roberts' career management, even if he's a younger guy. And I think maybe because he's a younger guy, he's actually focused on not rushing himself too much, a little bit more. But Roosevelt Roberts has handled his career like a pro. I mean, he goes undefeated, fights a bunch of guys, goes on the Contender Series, which is always a good way to get a sort of somewhat more beneficial start to the UFC. They usually like to take care of their Contender Series guys, you know. But he comes through the Contender Series, then he fights not absolute monsters straight away. He beats Darrell Horcher, he beats Thomas Gifford, then he loses to Vince Pichel, he beats Yakovlev, which isn't a massive jump up again. Then he has an opportunity, I'm sure. Roosevelt Roberts, very marketable. He was on main cards that maybe he shouldn't have been on before just because they love to push the Contender Series guys. Then he takes on Brock Weaver, beats him, and he calls out Matt Frevola. He's on a 2-fight win streak, very highly ranked outside the rankings in the lightweight division. He has an opportunity to jump up the rankings, but he's not calling out the rankings yet. I think he understands that he is a work in progress, and I like that mindset from him because, listen, he's had, 6 fights in the UFC, which means he's already renegotiated a contract because usually guys sign with a 5-fight contract, more likely than not, especially when they're an undefeated prospect like Roosevelt Roberts. The UFC more than likely wants to keep them on. Roosevelt Roberts has just handled it well. He's re-signed against Brock Weaver, then he's going to take on Jim Miller, then I know he's going to call out Matt Frevola as well, who is also on the card, which I'm excited for. He's generating hype. He has an entertaining style to watch. I think he gets the job done over Jim Miller. I like Jim Miller, man. It's hard to root against him, honestly, because I'm a big fan, but I just... When I see you're losing to guys like Charles Oliveira, Drew Dober, Josh Emmett, you know... Not those guys, sorry, that's a completely different record I was looking at. When I see, I was looking at Scott Holtzman's record there. When I see you're starting to lose to guys like Charles Oliveira, Dan Hooker, Anthony Pettis, Dustin Poirier, I think, you know what, maybe you're just not elite. But then when these Francisco Trinaldos and Scott Holtzmans start sneaking their way in there over the past few years, I'm starting to see a bit of a fade. And I'll be honest, I don't know how much I credit a win over Clay Guida. Hang on a second. Clay Guida made BJ Penn look competitive. And I don't mean to disrespect the name of BJ Penn, but if you aren't completely annihilating BJ Penn at this point, I mean, regular pub goers in Hawaii can KO BJ Penn. We've all seen the street video. Clay Guida couldn't do what a drunken fat Hawaii man could. Hawaiian was probably a better use of terminology rather than Hawaii man. Sounds like a really bad superhero, but still, I just think that Roosevelt Roberts gets the jump on him, and I want to see the Matt Frevola fight after this one. I don't want to see him beat Jim Miller and then all of a sudden me looking at the rankings, because Matt Frevola is fighting on the same card. That's interesting. I like storylines before someone hits the rankings, because then when they do hit the rankings, we already know who they are. We know how good they are. There's not a question of, oh, is he ready? He is ready because he's beaten this list of guys. And I think if he does win this one, he wants to go after Matt Frevola, who has a win over Roosevelt Roberts' teammate in Jarlin Turner, I believe it was. Yes, it was Jarlin Turner. Roosevelt wants revenge. I like this storyline. If Matt Frevola gets to jump on Frank Camacho, which I think he will, I'd like to see that fight happen afterwards. I don't want to see either of them get jumped straight into the rankings. The lightweight division right now in the rankings is an absolute logjam. I mean, Islam Makhachev can't get a jump up the rankings. Drew Dober is going to be kind of left out. Beneil Dariush has been beating guys left, right, and centre, and even he can't get a jump up in the rankings. Like, there's a lot of guys that need to be fed first before we start focusing on Roosevelt Roberts and Matt Frevola, is what I'm kind of saying. And I think Matt Frevola beats Camacho by decision. I guess I'll give that prediction as well in this one, because I'm not going to make a full fight video for that one. Roosevelt Roberts also wins by decision. I just think he wants it more every round. He has more output, and he just outlands Jim Miller on the scorecards. Jim Miller is a guy, I know he has power, but Roosevelt Roberts has shown no sign of a bad chin to me, and Jim Miller also only has 4 TKO wins in his career. I know he's got power, but, you know, that last fight with Scott Holtzman, I saw a different Jim Miller, is what I'm trying to get at. So I think that Roosevelt's going to get the jump on him. Especially seeing as, you know, Roosevelt Roberts has had a full camp and has fought under these conditions before, and Jim Miller has just got the call. You know, after a really bad loss to Scott Holtzman, where he took a shit ton of damage. I feel like Roosevelt gets the job done. Then do him versus Frevola, and then we'll talk about rankings. Goodbye. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe. Click that button there. See you later.